Well, the president has just finished his address to the nation, and was that a speech? I mean, it felt almost like it was a bad, fast-talking infomercial with a lot of anti-immigrant language just intertwined in there. It was extremely loose on facts, and he basically tried to shout his alleged accomplishments at the American people as if that was going to convince them that they were all true. I'm going to get some reaction and experts help analyzing what he said in just a moment. But first, I just want to quickly fact check just a few. I mean, there were so many in there. We were working as quickly as we could, but just a few of the president's most blatant falsehoods. Tonight, Trump announced checks for $1,776 for U.S. troops. First of all, Congress controls the power of the purse in the country, not the president. So if that happens, that is Congress sending those checks, even if Trump puts his name on them. But that number, $1,776, is also kind of interesting because an analysis from the Yale Budget Lab estimates that as of November, Trump tariffs have cost Americans an average of $1,700 per household this year. Trump also claimed that when he took office, inflation was the worst in 48 years. That's not true. The truth is that inflation had been declining from its peak of 7% during the pandemic. But since Trump took office, it has basically flatlined at 3%. It was 3% in January, and it's 3% today. In his campaign, Trump also claimed he would end inflation on day one. Now, just last week, the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, said that, quote, inflation remains somewhat elevated. There you go. Trump said he's working to bring grocery prices down. Now, just this week, this is where it gets awkward for him, Trump's own agriculture department released a report showing that food prices are rising faster than inflation. And everybody, by the way, is living that at grocery stores. Trump also claimed that he's brought gas prices down to $1.99 a gallon. The national average for a gallon of gasoline was $3.11 when Trump took office. The national average today per AAA is $2.91. That is just a little taste and flavor, and I'm sure you all have your own lists at home. Again, just a short list, but I'm sure I missed plenty of things. So joining me now are two people who have been paying very close attention. MS Now senior White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, along with co-host of The Weekend, Catherine Rampell, who is also the economics editor at The Bulwark. Okay, Catherine, let me just start with you because there were so many economic falsehoods in there. It was like Micro Machine, if people know that reference, man meets Pinocchio, just talking about the economy and shouting at the American public. What did you note in there that stuck out to you as the most glaring things?
Oh, man, that was like a manic Gish Gallop, if anybody ever did high school debate. There were a lot of lies per second there. I took some notes. So among the first things out of his mouth was a lie. He said that he inherited the worst inflation in 48 years. Absolutely not true. Inflation when he took office was about 3%. Today it is about 3%. Definitely not the highest in 48 years, and also no different today than it was at the beginning. It had been coming down, and then it bounced back up after Liberation Day. He talked about bringing prices down. That obviously has not happened. He had a bunch of statistics in there. I have no idea what the provenance of them it was. He said things like turkey prices have come down by a third. He said that they're building factories and plants at records he hasn't seen, neglecting to mention that we have had 7 consecutive months of manufacturing job losses. It is true that there is big investment in AI data centers, not so much in jobs. In fact, we are losing jobs. He talked about having the largest tax cuts in American history, demonstrably false, not to mention the fact that his tariffs are technically the largest tax increase as a percent of GDP in over 30 years. And don't take my word for it. That's the Conservative Tax Foundation that came up with that. Made up a whole bunch of other things about costs coming down. I don't know where these numbers came from. He talked about how he's going to appoint someone to the Federal Reserve who's going to bring down interest rates and bring down mortgage costs. I have no doubt that that is what he hopes will happen. However, the chair of the Federal Reserve cannot, in fact, unilaterally bring down interest rates and certainly cannot bring down mortgage costs, particularly if we're not building more homes in this country, which we probably won't be because he's deporting the entire construction labor force. There was a whole bunch of other stuff in there. You mentioned a lot of the anti-immigrant rhetoric about he talked about how immigrants are taking our jobs, driving up rents. I don't know where he's getting some of these numbers from. Again, I'd have to do like a big ChatGPT or Google search or something to figure out where these numbers are coming from. He said some other things about like the cost of law enforcement has gone up so high that it's not even to be mentioned, which is why he didn't mention a number. But in fact, if you look at the economic cost of his immigration policies, a new report from the National Foundation for American Policy found that the Trump administration's policies on illegal and legal immigration would reduce the projected number of workers in the U.S. by 6.8 million people by 2028 and lower the annual rate of economic growth by almost a third.
There's so much more to dig into here, and we just wanted to give you all a sense. I mean, Vaughn, the backdrop here, I mean, Stephen Miller seems like he has little paws all over that speech because there were just moments where it almost felt like a knee-jerk, anti-immigrant, xenophobic kind of phrase, false information, inaccurate details he's sharing about the impact of immigrants on the country. This is all the backdrop of all of this, and I started the show talking about this, is also, as you well know, a lot of things happening in this White House. I mean, the Susie Wiles mind-blowing piece came out just yesterday. The Epstein files are due in 2 days. House Republicans kind of rejected the Trump agenda, or the Trump desires, I should say, on Capitol Hill today. They're trying to wage what seems to be an illegal war in Venezuela. What led to that Micro Machine fast-talking infomercial that we just heard?
To a certain extent, things are out of President Trump's control. When you're on the campaign trail, right, or if you're in the courtroom with your lawyers, right, you can walk out, you can go yell into a microphone, and you can go and try to convince the masses that you are being politically targeted for prosecution, right? You can go and bat Joe Biden over the head as Sleepy Joe all you want. And that's what he's done the last couple years. But now he's the president of the United States, and he's got a 4-year term. It was his own Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, that back in July was very specific. He said Biden's first quarter is behind us, and growth is already accelerating. Congratulations, America. We're just getting started. That was this summer. The Trump administration now, with President Trump's own speech tonight, are suddenly bringing Joe Biden and blaming him again for the economic situation that Americans find themselves in. And when I say it's out of his control, right, I was talking a week ago at an event that he did in Pennsylvania, where I was talking to his own supporters about what grade they would give the economy. There were Ds, C minuses, B minuses. That's the state of America. And the president used, with a lack of hubris here today, an attempt to try to convince Americans that their lives and the situation of this country is better than so many people are actually expressing.
There's always kind of a swirl. I mean, some people are working on speeches like these, but not everybody in the building, right? So what was going on with everybody else in the building today? Were they dealing with all the other stuff, or what were they most freaking out about?
You know what struck me is you mentioned Stephen Miller, but the speech actually kind of sounded like plaques that were just installed at the White House today.
Yeah, I saw that. Tell us more about that.
There were plaques. The president made this presidential walk of fame outside of the West Wing where there's a portrait of every prior president. And those have been up now for a couple weeks. But today they added plaques, and I walked by and was reading them and calling Joe Biden Sleepy Joe, saying Barack Obama was one of the most divisive political figures in history. Those were the official plaques. And reading through it, it sounds like a Trump Truth Social post. His speech tonight sounded like a Trump Truth Social post. And I think this is where Susie Wiles' profile reveals that, well, she facilitates, right, sort of this structure of a White House that effectively allows Donald Trump to be himself. That speech tonight, 10 months in, was Donald Trump being himself, and he delivered the speech where he wanted to tell everybody, America's the hottest country in the world, right? He literally said the line, we have achieved anything more than anyone could have ever imagined. And when he talks about the state of this country, we need to be clear. European allies, Canada, Mexico are questioning just how hot America is right now and whether we are committed to the global order that has held up the global construct ever since World War II. And so while President Trump there is trying to convince Americans that all is fine and dandy, America's closest allies are questioning that. Donald Trump just had prime time. He interrupted the season finale of Survivor. Okay, we're talking about more than 5 million people that are watching that on CBS tonight. The president just interrupted that and was able to deliver essentially a campaign speech. That is not what addresses like this. You know this from the White House. It is usually for a major domestic or international incident or announcement. That was not this.
It is usually for a major international event, and White Houses have to make pitches. I remember quite well when the networks rejected Barack Obama's request and our request from the White House to air a speech on immigration that actually had policy in it. But usually you have to meet a certain bar in order to get that time. And I assume there's going to be a lot of meetings in these networks tomorrow morning about whether or not to do that again. If they ask again, we will see. Catherine, let me ask you just about tariffs, because he keeps repeating. I know he is not a policy guy. We all know that. But he keeps repeating that tariffs are his favorite word. This is something he said in his bizarre economic speech he gave a few weeks ago where he talked about dolls and pencils. He said it again tonight. It seemed like he was reading very quickly from the teleprompter, so maybe that was something he ad-libbed, who knows, or they wrote in for him because they knew he would say it. Just give us kind of a level set here. I mentioned some of the statistics we've seen about the impacts on individual households, about his tariff policies at this point and what they have done to American households.
So I would say, first of all, fact-checked true. Tariff probably is his favorite word. So
Fair.
At least that part is correct.
Seems to be.
But pretty much everything else that he has said about tariffs is false. It is Americans who are, by and large, paying these tariffs. And we can see it in the data. We are already seeing, again, as I mentioned before, inflation ticking up. It hasn't come up quite as much, I think, as a lot of people had feared, in part because a lot of companies are betting that the tariffs are going to get struck down by the Supreme Court pretty soon. And so they've been trying to avoid passing on costs to the extent possible to their consumers, but they're passing on some of those costs. And look, let's say that the Supreme Court does strike down those tariffs. Trump has been bragging about all of the revenue that they have raised. If the Supreme Court, in fact, says that those tariffs are unconstitutional or illegal, as they are expected to do, that is going to blow a huge hole in the federal budget that Trump does not have a way of filling. And in fact, he has already triple counted the use of the tariff revenue that he may well have to give back. He said that it's plugging a hole in the budget. Maybe he's going to send out more Trump checks. Who knows how he's going to pay for these bonuses for service members, which, as you rightly pointed out, Congress would have to actually appropriate. But in general, the consequence of his tariffs so far is higher prices, fewer jobs. As I mentioned, manufacturing jobs are down, and a lot of uncertainty and a slowdown in the economy.
No question about all of that. And tariffs, yeah, probably his favorite word. So, Vaughn, you are very familiar with kind of what's happening in there and how they react to events here. Chris and I were talking a little bit earlier about what happens next with Trump. I mean, Trump, does he post something on Truth Social tonight that eats this up? Is there news tomorrow that they put out? What do you think is swirling around there, around this speech?
I mean, last night we were taken aback when he posted late last night about, putting up a blockade around Venezuela. Effectively, what one could argue would be a violation of international law or an act of war. And so I think on any given moment, it's a question. The Epstein files are due on Friday. And so, I mean, when we go to the White House, I think when you were at the White House, I think there was a little bit more order and expectation among the press corps about what the deliverables were going to be on a certain day. But covering this White House, it is difficult, the number of subject matters to report on any given day, and to try to catch up with the fact checks and try to deal with some of these realities here. For how this White House is responding, it is a small nucleus around him there of folks, and the extent to which this president here was able to deliver the speech he wanted to tonight, clearly, right? There is still a Russia's war to end, and the president promised that he'd finish that in 24 hours. That hasn't happened here, and in so many ways, it seemed like tonight was a defensive speech, one in which he tried to justify the reasons, whether it be economy, whether it be some of these wars like Russia's war, seemed to try to justify the reasons why Americans are feeling or questioning the success of this administration up to this point here.
No question, when you yell quickly through a speech, that is giving an indication you're a bit on the defense, which certainly was the tone of what we just saw. Vaughn Hillyard, Catherine Rampell, thank you both so much.
I don't know what people think me and Cash are doing all day. I mean, I gave up everything for this. I mean, my wife is struggling. I'm not a victim. I'm not Jim Comey. It's fine. I did this, and I'm proud I did it. But if you think we're there for tea and crumpets, well, I mean, Kash is there all day. We share it. Our offices are linked. He turns on the faucet. I hear it. He's there he gets in at like 6 o'clock in the morning. He doesn't leave till 7 at night. You know, I'm in there at 7:30 in the morning. He uses the gym. I work out in my apartment. But I stare at these four walls all day in D.C., you know, by myself, divorced from my wife. Not divorced, but I mean separated, divorced. And it's hard.
A full day's work is hard. Our colleague Carol Leonnig today broke the news that man who, in his own words, said it was, quote, hard, divorced from my wife, from my friends all day, staring at those four walls. That guy, the number 2 official at the FBI for less than a year, is preparing to vacate that position as soon as Friday. Dan Bongino, who, as we just showed you, made no secret of the struggle he faced in doing that job, has, according to Carol Leonnig's reporting, quote, quietly told confidants he plans to formally leave his job early in the new year and will not be returning to headquarters to work this month. That's according to 8 people briefed on his account. Several people said some of Bongino's personal effects have been cleared out of his office as of last week. Carol's still here, and I want to bring in former Assistant Special Agent in charge of the FBI, National Security and Intelligence Analyst Michael Feinberg. Carol, he said he was, quote, divorced from his wife, but then he said he meant separated physically, not divorced legally. But tell us what you are reporting about Dan Bongino.
Well, we first started hearing that Bongino was telling his inner team that he was leaving on Friday. Initially, Mr. Bongino declined to really engage on the record about this. We kept doing more reporting, and as you see, we now have 8 sources saying that he told his inner team and some senior FBI supervisors that he's leaving. And I will add, Nicole, that the president has just recently confirmed our reporting, which is always nice to have the president confirm your work when others would not, basically saying Bongino did a great job and is according to the president, under his understanding, is going back to podcasting. What we heard over and over again was that Bongino was not going to come back to the Bureau at all as of December 5th, and that he planned to publicly announce this December 19th. I know I can understand why Bongino probably did not want others to break this news. He wanted to break it first, but we've done that now.
Michael Feinberg, your reaction.
It was a short, tumultuous tenure, but in many ways, at the time he was appointed, Dan Bongino was the perfect man for the job, in that he combined the emotional temperament and impulse control of the president who appointed him with the intellectual rigor and operational savvy of the director to whom he reported, and the respect for the rule of law and constitutional norms of the attorney general who directly supervised them both. So in that sense, his complete lack of dedication to the Constitution, law enforcement norms, and the apolitical nature of the FBI fit right in with the past year in the executive branch. But that said, I have not spoken to a single soul at the FBI who is not overjoyed at this news, because Bongino's impact on the organization has been wholly that of a bull in a china shop, and a great number of people have lost their jobs due to his fickle inability to recognize that people can hold one view in their personal life and not bring it with them to work and execute on their job solely on a professional, apolitical basis.
If you'll both indulge me, I mean, I think Carol is one of the country's most respected journalists because of her objectivity. Michael, you've spent your career in the FBI, and so let it fall to me. This guy is a freaking joke. He wears T-shirts that are obviously too small, and he went on Fox News and complained about how long the workday is as the number 2 at the FBI. The FBI, as you two know better than anyone, protects children from child sex traffickers. And on that topic, Dan Bongino had a successful podcast in part because he peddled conspiracy theories about Jeffrey Epstein and then got to the FBI and let Pam Bondi roll over him when they decided to cover up the files because Donald Trump's name is in them, a fact confirmed by Susie Wiles this week in 11 on-the-record interviews with Chris Whipple. I want to know if either of you can speak to the lasting damage or the danger that we're in, because a guy that is a joke was the number 2 at the FBI, Michael.
Yeah, look, I was obviously being completely sarcastic in my initial praise of him. His influence on the FBI and his impact on the safety of our country's communities has been wholly negative. He is personally responsible for the jettisoning of a great number of senior executives who dedicated their lives to the service of this country, who had collectively between them centuries of subject matter expertise in how to disrupt terrorist plots, stop foreign spies, and unravel criminal enterprises. And he got rid of them because he was concerned they did not vote for the right person. That sort of justification for raising an entire institution is something that we have never seen before in our country's history. The FBI is a worse place because of him. The country is less safe because of him. And the damage he caused is going to take us decades to rebuild if we ever get the chance.
You know, I pray to God that when, I don't know, cooler minds doesn't even seem like the right word, but when an appreciation of the centuries of experience that he purged from the FBI makes its way back, that in the intervening period, nothing happens to this country, nothing bad, but that's a wish. That is me wish casting. And nobody that has worked in national security thinks that there's a very strong chance that nothing will happen.
So tell me a little bit about what we know regarding Jack Smith's appearance today, Glenn.
Well, it's been going on for about 2.5 hours. We've had a couple of breaks, I think 3 breaks, in which Smith was chased around the halls and he walked away silently without commenting. I think the most noteworthy thing that happened in public was a Fox crew nearly followed Jack in the House of Representatives today, which would have made news. But what we are hearing generally about the testimony behind closed doors is initially it has focused on the toll data that Smith and Company in the special counsel's office had requested from these 8 to 10 Republican senators regarding their interactions with the White House on or around January 6, 2021. That seems to have been the tenor. Generally speaking, the body language inside the room, I'm told from several people, has been pretty relaxed. It hasn't been overtly confrontational. And I spoke with a couple of the Democratic members of the committee who were in there who seemed to feel very, very confident that Smith was handling himself well, almost to the point where they were had a tone of mockery about the disparity between Smith's capacity to answer questions and the Republican staff members' capacity to ask them.
Is it staff members that are asking these questions from Republicans, or is it Republican lawmakers, Glenn?
It's a combination of both. It's committee, the way that these depositions typically work, or it's committee staff working in conjunction with members. And that generally, we should say, the biggest issue here is that this is taking place behind closed doors. Jack Smith had wanted to have this happen in public. Jim Jordan, it is well known on the Hill, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, had real concerns about Smith being given a public platform to make the case against President Trump that he was denied making a report. So there's a deep political calculation that went into this to keep Smith out of the public view.
So that's interesting. Let's bring in Carol Leonnig, MS Now senior investigative reporter. So, Carol, what Glenn just said there, again, is interesting because on the one hand, you have Jim Jordan not wanting Jack Smith to lay out what his investigation found, lay out the case that he had against Donald Trump that he was denied. But on the other hand, still projecting that Jack Smith is a political animal, this was a political prosecution, that he is corrupt, and that they need to question him behind closed doors. Those two things are in conflict with each other.
They absolutely are, Katie. And, you know, it's been a great source of frustration for Jack Smith and his legal counsel and team, and indeed his entire former special counsel office. Most of them, if they still worked at the Department of Justice, have been fired by Donald Trump. But it's been a source of frustration because Jack Smith being able to articulate the evidence that he gathered to the degree he's able to discuss that which is already public, for him to narrate what he found could be very devastating publicly for Donald Trump, because it's a platform at which he can say, here's what we found, here's why we thought there was evidence of a crime, and here's why a grand jury indicted Donald Trump, both on illegally interfering in a free and fair election, conspiring to block the rightful victory of Joe Biden, and intentionally hoarding and withholding national defense information. And by that, I mean classified documents at his home in Mar-a-Lago when he was no longer president and no longer had any right to them. I want to say one more thing, Katie, though you didn't ask it. I know it is going to be your next question. I mean, part of what the big worry is about a closed session for Jack Smith and his team, as we have learned in our reporting, is that this will be used in a way to trip him up or to trap him. In other words, to cherry pick things he has said and try to use them publicly to, once again, as the Republicans appear, determined to do, rewrite history. The evidence that Donald Trump withheld intentionally classified records was overwhelming. There was video surveillance. There were text messages with him and his aides asking them to move those records from a place right before they were supposed to be searched by his own attorney. The evidence is overwhelming in pictures and in testimony from witnesses. And so Jack Smith being able to articulate that would be very difficult. But the Republicans do not want to hear that story. They want to choose the evidence they want to present to the public after they sit down with him in a closed hearing.
Well, Jack Smith wanted to lay this out. Could he do so publicly on his own volition?
You know, the rule here, Katie, is that a former DOJ prosecutor or official must confer with the department before speaking before Congress, before speaking publicly about the events that they learned about during their job. That is what they're supposed to do. My understanding from our reporting is that Jack Smith did not get very clear guidance from the Department of Justice. It was at times vague about what he could discuss, other than to say, you can talk about what is already public.
So the Republicans, this is a memo shared by Chuck Grassley, they don't believe, Tom, that the special counsel had established probable cause for the search warrant for classified records at Mar-a-Lago. What do you make of that assertion from the Republicans, Tom?
Well, the basis for the Republican suspicion that he may have lacked probable cause in large part lies in some back and forth emails among FBI agents and the Justice Department as they were preparing to execute the warrant on Mar-a-Lago. I think where the Republicans may face a challenge, though, is really bringing out a lot of the evidence that Smith had that justified issuing and executing the search warrant. Because as Carol and others have reported, Smith is under very severe restrictions from the Justice Department, from court orders, from ordinary rules governing the secrecy of grand jury proceedings and the like. He is heavily, heavily restricted in precisely what he can say. And I think that will make it difficult for the Republicans to try to go down that road, to try to show the public that Smith lacked probable cause to execute the warrant, because he knows, they know, everyone knows that Smith just isn't free to disclose a lot of the evidence and information that led him to make the decisions that he did.
What about the public record that we saw? I mean, we saw that surveillance video of Donald Trump's aide, Walt Nauta, moving boxes back into a storage unit. We got a lot of the back and forth. In the indictment, we got a lot of the evidence that Jack Smith had been able to accumulate on the basis after the FBI raid to prove that Donald Trump had done something wrong, was obstructing justice, and was hoarding those documents. From what you've seen of the public record, is there a lot of there for this Republican assertion?
I think that there is, I think there's a lot of there, frankly, from the Justice Department's perspective in terms of the evidence that they had that would support a finding of probable cause, based, again, on material that already is in the public record and that Jack Smith presumably could talk about in his deposition. But what I will say is that I think the Republicans do have a fair point that it does appear there was some serious internal disagreement within the Justice Department, within the FBI, about the propriety of executing a search warrant on Mar-a-Lago. That isn't always unusual. You often will have cases where there's a lot of internal division and dissent and disagreement about whether a search warrant is proper. But I do think the Republicans have a fair point, particularly if you have career FBI officials who are expressing concern and those concerns were overridden by Biden political appointees. I think that's fair ground. Not to say that there's no probable cause, but it's a fair point.
Yeah.
Let me allow Carol to jump in.
I totally understand why somebody wants to say it's a fair point, but I'd just like to put out what is already well publicly established, and no offense meant to anyone here, because the Republicans in this situation have cherry-picked information, and I feel like I know very exhaustively what happened in this situation. So they've chosen emails from May and June where FBI officials were debating probable cause. Totally healthy, just as you say, Tom. Totally healthy to have a debate back and forth. But that radically changes in July after the FBI obtains this surveillance tape. And the FBI asked to look at this surveillance tape from Mar-a-Lago. And it radically changes where there are documents which the Republicans have not released in this data dump that show FBI officials at the highest level, at the mid-level, all agreeing we've got probable cause now. It's so clear. And we report this in my book, Injustice, with Aaron Davis. I can point you to the page in it, but also two more important facts that Republicans have left out here in this story, and Glenn knows them well as well, which is a judge, an Article III judge, signed off that there was probable cause on August 5th for this raid to go forth on August 8th. And then the end-all be-all of probable cause, we went from probability to reality when the FBI agents raided that property, a surprise court-approved search, and left with hundreds of pages of top-secret records. The evidence of a crime was probable in August, and the evidence of a potential crime was actually collected.
Glenn, if the Democrats win in 2026, win control of either the House or the Senate or both, very much up in the air, are we going to see Jack Smith testifying publicly?
Oh, I think that would be a given. The question that I would also raise is, given this predicate of prosecuting the prosecutors, investigating the investigators, does this open the door? Have the Republicans actually opened the door to Democrats doing the same thing to Lindsey Halligan, to Ed Martin, to Jeanine Pirro, to Todd Blanche, to Pam Bondi? Have they created sort of a moral hazard for themselves once Democrats or if Democrats regain control of either House of the legislature or the presidency?
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. In 1 hour from now, Donald Trump is going to address the nation from the White House. Now, to be clear, it's not expected to be an Oval Office address, which is its own sort of genre, sitting at the desk. And it's usually that's kind of like a somber address, and there's some big reason they're doing it. And it obviously won't be an East Wing address either. And I guess you can guess why. The East Wing has been bulldozed by the president. So the president will instead speak from the diplomatic reception room, and he gave us a little preview of his message this afternoon.
What's your message this evening? Well, I think the message this evening is we inherited a mess, and we've done a great job, and we continue to, and our country is going to be stronger than ever before very soon. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah, that's about what I would expect. So unless he surprises us, which who knows, the speech will apparently be about how great everything is just in case you missed him at the beautiful Mount Airy Lodge and Casino last week. Trump clearly thinks he can talk his way out of the political mess that his mismanagement and lawlessness and corruption and cruelty have gotten him into so far. And so far, that's not working. Because as we have seen twice now, the American people can sometimes develop a sense of amnesia around Donald Trump, and somewhat understandably because the way he acts is so hard to really look in the face. It's so aberrant. It's almost comforting to forget it. And what happens, I think, is the public temporarily forgets who he is around election time. It's happened twice. And then they remember why they dislike him so much not long after. Trump's political support and control over the Republican Party are eroding before our eyes. A new AP poll today has his approval rating at 36%, which matches what Gallup found last month. And when you start seeing approval ratings that start with the number 3, that is when things get very, very dire politically. That is usually the line at which panic starts to set in a little bit with your co-partisans. Now, for the record, that 36% is only 2 points higher than Trump's approval after January 6, 2021. So the president is clearly desperate to change the narrative, and he's taking the airwaves to cajole us all into not believing our lying eyes when it comes to, well, chiefly the cost of living. And on the same day that Trump desperately tries to right the ship, we got another illustration of just how much his political standing has eroded in just the last few months. Because today, 4 Republicans signed on to a Democratic discharge petition to force a House vote on a 3-year extension of insurance subsidies that are set to expire for tens of millions of Americans 2 weeks from today. And they did so in explicit defiance of both Republican Speaker of the House Mike Johnson and Donald Trump, who ultimately wields the power of the speakership functionally. Now, this has become something of an emerging pattern. You'll remember last month, Republicans joined with Democrats to force an ultimately successful vote to repeal a Trump executive order that tried to bust collective bargaining rights for some federal workers. And that was a big deal. And of course, before that, there was the very notable discharge petition to force a vote on releasing the Epstein files, which Trump and Johnson lobbied aggressively against, right? Remember, they called Lauren Boebert into the Situation Room to turn the screws? To no avail. By the way, the deadline to release those files is this Friday. We'll be watching for that. Now, I've covered, Congress for decades, and I've covered a lot of discharge petitions. They're not unheard of. It's like, I was like a fake field goal in football, right? Like, it does happen, but usually it doesn't. It's very unusual to see so many back-to-back-to-back and successful ones. And this all speaks to the same underlying dynamic. Trump is on the wrong side of public opinion on a bunch of important issues, and he is politically weak. Specifically today, the big issue he's on the wrong side of, the one that Americans in poll after poll after poll say is most important, is the cost of living, and in this case, the cost of health care. Things cost too much. Voters hate it. They are blaming Trump for breaking his promise to, and you'll remember what it was, lower prices on day one of his presidency. Not just reduce the rate of inflation, lower prices. Now, Democrats in this instance are unified in bringing down insurance premiums, or at least not allowing them to spike. Republicans are not, which is why the Democrats are going to get their vote. And so now Mike Johnson is running around having to say things like this.
Have you lost control of the House?
I have not lost control of the House. No.
Because this is the third time.
Look, we have the smallest majority in U.S. history, okay? These are not normal times. When you have the luxury of having 10 or 15 people who disagree on something, you don't have to deal with it. But when you have a razor-thin margin, as we do, then all the procedures in the book people think are on the table, and that's the difference.
Now, I got to say, he is right about that, right? But having the thinnest majority of all time is also a little bit in tension with, like, the huge MAGA mandate. And if you're telling reporters that you have not lost control of the House, well, then you've probably lost control of the House. 3 discharge petitions in a row that have been successful. I've never seen that in my life. For what it's worth, Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia certainly thinks that Trump has lost his grip on the Republican conference, and she has done something of a crusade to oust Johnson before she resigns from Congress. Remember, Johnson only got the job in the first place because he was the compromise choice after Republicans chose to oust their last speaker, Kevin McCarthy, after he lost control of the conference. And then there was this idea that Johnson was going to be some sort of strategic genius, especially after he was able to force Donald Trump's one big, beautiful bill over the finish line. But the secret was that it was always Trump's strength, not Johnson's. As the New York Times reports, Trump tells people that he's both the speaker and the president. Even Mike Johnson likes to joke about his role among the conference.
I try to meet people where they're at. We have this joke that I'm not really a Speaker of the House, I'm really like a mental health counselor. I just try to sit down and listen to everybody and figure out what their primary need is and how we can meet that, you know. And sometimes those are long counseling sessions, but we get that done. But it's not unlike, I mean, it's the same skills you use as a parent.
So when Johnson loses control over his conference, like with today's petition on healthcare subsidies, on the day Donald Trump's going to address the nation, right? It really is Donald Trump who is losing control, and he knows it.